It was an ordinary weekend evening in London, England, still under lockdown during the pandemic. Sarah Everard, 33, had just left a friend's home in Clapham. Wearing a green jacket and white trainers, she began the familiar journey of less than 4 kilometers back to her flat. It was an evening like hundreds before it. The streets were quiet because of the lockdown restrictions, but Sarah had no reason to feel concerned. She spoke to her boyfriend on the phone as she walked, her voice still cheerful and relaxed. But it was the last time anyone close to her would ever hear her voice. The following morning, when Sarah failed to arrive at work, her boyfriend began to worry. He called and sent message after message, but received only a frightening silence. By that evening, with still no sign of her, he decided to contact the police. A major search was quickly launched across London, with hundreds of volunteers and police officers spreading out to search streets and parks. The case soon drew the attention of the entire country. But no one, not even the most experienced investigators, could have imagined the truth waiting ahead. The first clue did not lead police to an unknown stranger hiding in the shadows, as people often imagine in cases involving attacks on the street. It led directly to someone in uniform, someone entrusted by society with protecting the public. The identity of that person, and what happened to Sarah on that fateful night, would force the whole of Britain to confront a deeply troubling question. Are we truly safe with the very people who wear the badge of justice? Join me as we turn back through the case files of one of the most shocking and haunting criminal cases Britain has seen in decades. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any episode in our true crime series. Stay with us until the end of the video to understand the full truth behind this case that shocked the nation. Sarah Everard grew up in a middle-class family in Yorkshire, in the north of England. Her father was a university professor, and her mother was an architect. From an early age, Sarah was raised in an environment that valued education and independence. She attended one of the region's prestigious girls' schools before continuing her education at Durham University, one of the most respected universities in the United Kingdom. Friends and colleagues later described Sarah as a warm, intelligent woman with a strong sense of social responsibility. She worked in marketing for a media company, where she was highly regarded for her dedication and creativity. Outside work, Sarah was known for her love of dancing, music, and relaxed gatherings with friends. She was the kind of person who always made an effort to stay in touch with old friends, regularly organized small get-togethers, and was seen by many as an emotional anchor within her friendship group. Those who had worked with Sarah remembered her as a thoughtful colleague who was always willing to listen and support others. She enjoyed reading, loved nature, and often spent her weekends walking through London's parks or traveling north to visit her family. At the time of the case, Sarah had been living in London for several years. She was in a stable relationship and lived with her boyfriend in a small flat in the southern part of the city. Like millions of other young people in London, her life revolved around work, family, and the close friends she had remained connected with over many years. On the other side of the story was a man whose role was to uphold the law. He was 48 years old at the time and served as an officer with the Metropolitan Police Service, having joined the force in 2018. Before that, he had worked for the Civil Nuclear Constabulary, a role that required him to undergo strict background checks. Colleagues described him as private and reserved, with little interest in socializing. He was known for using a joking nickname within his unit, but no one could have imagined that behind the police badge was an entirely different person. He had been assigned to protect diplomatic premises and other critical sites across London, a position that allowed him to carry a firearm and exercise extensive law enforcement powers. That role, combined with the standard equipment issued to a police officer, would later become central to one of the most shocking crimes in the history of British policing. He lived with his wife and 2 young children in Kent, not far from London. On the surface, they appeared to be a settled family, and he appeared to be a devoted husband and father. But what investigators later uncovered suggested that behind this ordinary image was a long history of warning signs that had been overlooked for years. 2 people. 2 completely separate lives. They were about to cross paths on a fateful evening, one that neither of them could have anticipated. In the weeks leading up to that fateful evening, he began a series of actions that investigators would later describe as calculated and carefully planned. Several times during the month, he drove from Kent to London not to carry out police duties, but to observe and study routes that were quiet and largely deserted at night. He hired a separate vehicle that did not carry official police registration plates, paying for it through his personal bank account. This detail later led prosecutors to argue that his actions were not impulsive, but part of a deliberate plan developed over several weeks. Security cameras at shops along the route between Kent and London later captured him appearing on several occasions, purchasing items that seemed harmless when viewed individually. But when placed together, they formed a troubling picture of preparation. Investigators later reconstructed his movements using only those fragmented recordings, examining them frame by frame to establish exactly what had happened in the period leading up to that fateful evening. More concerning still, this was not the first time his behavior had drawn attention. Not long before, around Valentine's Day, there had been reports of indecent exposure near the area where he lived in Kent, isolated incidents that had never been connected to one another. At the time, however, no agency linked those events together, and the man wearing a police badge continued with his ordinary duties as though nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Sarah's life continued quietly. That day had been an ordinary working day, with nothing to distinguish it from hundreds of others throughout the year. That evening, she arranged to meet a close friend who lived in the Clapham Junction area of South London. The two had dinner together, talked and laughed as they had on many previous occasions, sharing everyday conversations about work, life, and plans for the near future. Nothing about that evening suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. At around 9 p.m., Sarah left her friend's home and began walking back to her flat. The journey was only about 4 kilometers, a route she had traveled countless times before. She wore a green rain jacket and a knitted beanie, walking with the confidence of a woman who had lived in the city for years and knew its streets and shortcuts well. At the same time, not far away, the hired vehicle was moving through the streets of London, drawing closer to the area Sarah was about to pass through. Two paths that appeared to have nothing to do with one another were gradually closing in a convergence that no one could have predicted or prevented. None of the people passing through the area that night could have imagined that, within minutes, one of the most shocking criminal cases in modern British history was about to begin. He stepped out of the vehicle and approached Sarah on a quiet pavement, where the sparse streetlights made the surroundings feel more still than ever. In his hand was a small identification card, something people in Britain had been taught to trust without question. He identified himself as a police officer and claimed that she had breached the strict lockdown regulations enforced during the pandemic. The accusation was entirely fabricated. But at that moment, in a city gripped by uncertainty over the pandemic, in the darkness of the night and faced with an official-looking police identification card, what reason would a woman have to doubt the very person society had entrusted with protecting her? According to the evidence later presented in court, he used handcuffs to restrain Sarah at the scene, claiming that he needed to take her to a police station to clarify the matter. Caught off guard and given no reason to doubt an officer apparently carrying out his duties, Sarah did not resist. She was placed inside the hired vehicle, the same vehicle he had carefully prepared for this purpose weeks earlier. From that point, instead of heading towards any police station, the vehicle left London and travelled towards Kent, around 50 miles away. During the journey, which lasted several hours in the darkness, Sarah had no idea that the man behind the wheel had no intention of taking her to a police station. The quiet motorways at midnight and the headlights passing each roadside marker carried her further and further away from the city she had always considered home. The court found that, after arriving in a remote area of Kent, he subjected Sarah to a serious sexual assault. This was one of the offences he later admitted in court without dispute, establishing the circumstances of the case clearly from the beginning of the legal proceedings. Afterwards, using the belt from his own police uniform, he killed Sarah. The judge who later presided over the case concluded that the crimes had been planned and calculated in advance, rather than being an impulsive act committed in a moment. But even after committing the crime, he did not stop. In an effort to conceal evidence and delay identification, he set fire to Sarah's body. He then placed it inside a bag normally used for carrying building materials and concealed it in woodland near a property he knew in the area. The location was not chosen at random, but reflected a familiarity with the local landscape that could only have come from someone who had lived there for many years. While all of this was happening in a secluded part of Kent, Sarah's family and friends in London were still waiting for her to return, completely unaware of what had taken place during the night. Her phone had been silent for hours, but none of them could yet imagine the full significance of that silence until dawn arrived and Sarah still had not appeared. The following morning, as the first rays of sunlight came through the windows of their flat, Sarah's boyfriend began to feel that something was wrong. She had not returned home the night before as planned. Her phone went unanswered, ringing repeatedly before diverting to voicemail. The messages he had sent remained unread, a small detail, but one unsettling enough to make anyone feel that something was not right. At first, he tried to reassure himself. Perhaps she had stayed at her friend's home. Perhaps her phone battery had gone flat. But when the working day began, and Sarah's colleagues called to ask about her because she had not arrived at the office, concern quickly turned into genuine fear. He contacted the friend Sarah had visited the night before. The answer made the situation clearer than ever. Sarah had left at around 9 p.m., alone, intending to walk home along the familiar route she had taken many times before. It was the last time anyone had heard anything from her, not a phone call, not a message, and not a single sign that she had arrived home safely. By that evening, after every attempt to contact her had failed, Sarah's boyfriend decided to report her missing to the local police. At first, the case was treated as a routine missing person investigation, something that was not uncommon, particularly at a time when many people were still trying to adjust to the disruption caused by the pandemic. But when investigators began reviewing security camera footage along the route Sarah was expected to have taken, the nature of the case immediately changed. The final images showed Sarah walking alone along the street. After that, there was no further footage showing her continuing towards home. News of Sarah's disappearance quickly spread across social media. Her family issued an urgent appeal, sharing photographs and descriptions of what she had been wearing on the night she disappeared. Thousands of people reposted the appeal, hoping that someone might have seen her. Police rapidly launched a large-scale operation, working alongside hundreds of volunteers to search parks, open grassland, and secluded areas along the route Sarah had traveled. Police dogs and helicopters were also deployed to support the search, examining every patch of scrub and every roadside ditch in an effort to find any clue that might lead to her whereabouts. Over the following days, the case became the focus of national media attention across Britain, sparking deep concern about women's safety when traveling alone at night. Major news outlets provided constant updates, public figures spoke out to express their concern, and across social media, thousands of women shared their own experiences of having to walk alone after dark. But no one, not even the most experienced investigators, could have imagined that the most important clue in the case was hidden within the very law enforcement system itself, the institution that was meant to represent safety and protection. While search teams continued tirelessly combing through outdoor areas, another group of investigators was working quietly inside an office, seated before dozens of computer screens, surrounded by stacks of case files and cold cups of coffee left on their desks. Their task was not to search in the field, but to piece together hundreds of hours of CCTV footage collected from across the city, a job requiring absolute patience, where a single overlooked detail could cause an entire lead to disappear. They began at the last location where Sarah had been seen, then worked backwards through every frame and every camera angle, trying to identify any vehicle that appeared repeatedly or behaved unusually in the area during the time she disappeared. After several days of painstaking review, without overlooking even the faintest image, one detail began to emerge. A particular vehicle appeared repeatedly across CCTV cameras along Sarah's route, moving in a pattern unlike that of any other vehicle in the area. Investigators immediately traced the registration number and cross-checked it against vehicle hire records across the country. The result left the entire investigation room silent. The vehicle had been hired by someone whose name appeared within the personnel records of the Metropolitan Police Service. Not an ordinary member of the public, not an unknown stranger, but a serving police officer, someone who wore the uniform trusted by the public every day, someone who had sworn to protect the very citizens he was meant to serve. That name was Wayne Couzens. The information was immediately passed to the highest levels of command during an emergency meeting held that same night. The atmosphere in the room changed completely from the usual focus of a criminal investigation to an intensity few of those present had ever experienced. This was no longer simply a missing person case requiring investigation. It had become an institutional crisis, one that threatened the credibility of the entire police service. Investigators quickly expanded their inquiries, examining Couzens' duty rosters, employment records, and movements in the days before and after Sarah disappeared. Each separate piece of information, the hired vehicle, his unusual trips into London, unexplained absences during scheduled duties, and suspicious personal spending gradually fitted together to form a complete picture pointing in only one direction. Within hours of this breakthrough, a decision was made. Wayne Couzens would be questioned, and his home in Kent would become the next target of an investigation now moving at unprecedented speed. No investigator on the team could afford to lose focus, because they understood that every hour could mean the difference between life and the worst outcome no one wanted to contemplate. It was still dark when a convoy of police vehicles quietly entered the small street where Couzens lived with his family in Kent. There were no sirens and no flashing lights. Everything was carried out in complete silence, because senior officers understood that this was not an ordinary arrest operation. The man they were about to take into custody was one of their own colleagues, someone who had once stood alongside them, worn the same uniform representing justice, and taken the same oath during the formal ceremony every police officer was required to complete. Couzens was detained inside his home, in front of his wife and young children. No resistance was reported. He was led away quietly, in stark contrast to the image of an authoritative police officer that colleagues and neighbors had known for many years. Neighbors who witnessed the scene from their windows later said they could not believe what was unfolding before them. A family they had always considered ordinary and peaceful had suddenly become the center of an investigation that would shock the entire country. Initially, the formal allegation against Cousins was kidnapping, directly connected to Sarah's disappearance. He was held at a high-security detention facility while awaiting further questioning by a specialist investigative team. His defense lawyers did not immediately apply for bail, an indication that even the defense recognized the seriousness of the situation their client was facing. News of the arrest spread rapidly, not only throughout the police service but across British society. The fact that a serving police officer had become the main suspect in the kidnapping of a woman sent shockwaves across the United Kingdom. Senior leaders within the Metropolitan Police Service were immediately confronted with a series of difficult questions from the media about recruitment procedures, internal oversight, and institutional accountability. Politicians and women's rights organizations also spoke out, demanding a comprehensive and independent investigation into how someone like this could have remained within and advanced through the police ranks for years without being identified. While Cousins was being questioned at the detention facility, another development was quietly unfolding nearby. Based on new information gathered from the initial evidence and mobile phone location data, crime scene investigators expanded the search to a wooded area in Kent. The location was not far from the home of the man now being held in custody, a connection that no one on the investigation team believed was coincidental. Only hours later, a devastating discovery pushed the case into an entirely different chapter, a chapter that no one waiting for news about Sarah had ever wanted to face, and one that brought an end to every remaining fragment of hope held by her family. The woodland where the search team was deployed lay deep within the Ashford area, a remote part of Kent where dense trees almost completely blocked the view from the main road and few people passed through, apart from local residents familiar with the terrain. This was not a random location, it was situated not far from a property to which Cousins had a personal connection, a detail that made investigators even more confident they were following the right direction from the very first hours of the operation. Forensic specialists and police dog teams entered the area in silence, establishing a secured perimeter under strict procedures to preserve every trace that might later assist the investigation. Specialist tents were quickly erected to shield the area from the view of journalists and curious members of the public who had begun gathering nearby. Not long afterwards, a builder's bag was discovered, concealed beneath a layer of leaves and dry branches. What was found inside left even the most experienced officers on the team visibly shaken. Some had to step outside the secured area for a moment to regain their composure before returning to their duties. The scene was regarded as one of the most distressing cases Kent police had encountered in many years, one that many within the service later acknowledged would remain with them throughout their careers. Because of the severe damage to the remains, forensic specialists were unable to carry out identification using standard methods. Instead, they relied on dental records previously provided by Sarah's family, comparing the smallest details, each dental feature, and every record of past treatment to reach a final conclusion with the level of certainty required under national forensic standards. After many hours of intense work at the forensic laboratory, the result was confirmed. The remains were those of Sarah Everard. The news was conveyed privately to her family before being formally announced to the public, in accordance with the compassionate procedures used by British police in cases of this kind. The moment Sarah's family received the official confirmation was one of the most painful experiences that words could never fully describe. For almost a week, they had held on to every small fragment of hope, telling themselves that perhaps Sarah had simply encountered some unexpected difficulty and that she would return safely. But now, that final door of hope had closed forever, leaving behind a void nothing could fill. Immediately after her identity was confirmed, Kent police formally upgraded the allegation against Cousins from kidnapping to a far more serious charge. This marked a critical legal turning point, opening the way for a broader investigation into the full sequence of actions he had carried out on that fateful night, while also laying the foundation for the intense questioning that would follow. During the first days of his detention, Cousins remained almost completely silent when questioned by investigators. He refused to cooperate and offered no explanation for his movements on the night Sarah disappeared, even as the evidence against him grew stronger by the hour, from CCTV footage to mobile phone location records. The interviews took place in a small, windowless room, where every question and answer was fully recorded in accordance with criminal procedure in England. Sitting opposite Cousins were experienced investigators who were accustomed to dealing with suspects who chose to remain silent. But they had rarely faced silence from a former colleague, someone who had once trained alongside them and shared the long hours of overnight shifts. The growing weight of the evidence eventually forced Cousins to change his approach. At a preliminary court hearing, he admitted to kidnapping for the first time. The move surprised many people in the courtroom because of its sudden openness after days of complete silence, although no one knew exactly what had caused him to change his position so abruptly. Not long afterwards, at a further hearing held at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, which has heard some of the most serious cases in British legal history, Cousins admitted to a further charge of serious sexual assault. He entered each guilty plea in an even, almost emotionless voice. Many people in the courtroom, including experienced journalists who had covered hundreds of criminal trials, were visibly disturbed by the manner in which he spoke. Then, in July 2021, in another development that sent shockwaves across the country, Cousins formally admitted to the most serious charge, the murder of Sarah Everard. The guilty plea came at the last moment, just before his full trial was due to begin. It spared Sarah's family from having to endure a longer and more painful trial, although they still had to sit in the courtroom and witness the moment themselves. However, Cousins' guilty pleas were not accompanied by any detailed explanation of the true motive behind his actions. Prosecutors and the judge later concluded that he had shown no genuine remorse. Instead, he appeared simply to have accepted the reality that could no longer be denied in the face of the overwhelming body of evidence investigators had painstakingly gathered over many months. For Sarah's family, the guilty pleas brought deeply conflicting emotions. They were both a painful confirmation of what they had feared for months and a small measure of justice they were forced to accept, knowing that nothing could ever truly compensate for what they had lost, and that no admission of guilt could bring back the daughter, sister and friend they loved. The final sentencing hearing took place in late September 2021 and attracted the attention of media outlets across the United Kingdom. Dozens of journalists lined up outside the Old Bailey from early in the morning, hoping to secure a seat inside the courtroom. With the courtroom filled to capacity, the presiding judge spent considerable time examining the exceptional seriousness of the case before delivering the final sentence. At the center of the court's reasoning was the fact that Cousins had exploited the authority and position entrusted to him as a police officer to carry out his crimes. The judge compared the gravity of the case with offenses driven by political or extremist motives, referring to a previous case involving the murder of a British member of Parliament, the only earlier case in which a similarly severe sentencing framework had been applied. The comparison reflected the shared level of threat posed to the foundations of democratic society. According to the court, Cousins' actions had not only caused immeasurable harm to Sarah's family but had also seriously undermined public trust in the police as an institution. They had particularly damaged women's sense of safety when traveling alone at night, a broader systemic harm that the court regarded as a significant aggravating factor when determining the sentence. In the end, Cousins was sentenced to a whole life order, the most severe punishment available under English law since the death penalty was abolished decades earlier. He would never be released from prison for the remainder of his life, although he retained the legal right to pursue an appeal through the established judicial process. Before the sentence was announced, Sarah's family read an emotional statement to the court. They spoke of the irreplaceable pain of their loss, the ordinary moments they would never again be able to share with her, and their belief that justice had, in some measure, been achieved. Yet they also made clear that no sentence could bring Sarah back to them, or erase the grief that had become deeply embedded over the previous 7 months. Immediately after the sentence was handed down, the Sarah Everard case continued to send shockwaves across the United Kingdom. At Clapham Common, near the area where Sarah had taken some of her final steps, thousands of people gathered spontaneously to pay tribute, laying flowers and lighting candles in an atmosphere of quiet grief and emotion. The site became a symbol of the movement demanding greater safety for women in public spaces, a movement that soon spread beyond the borders of the United Kingdom. The response did not end there. A national independent inquiry was established to review the Metropolitan Police Service's recruitment procedures, oversight systems, and internal culture, with the involvement of numerous independent experts from outside the policing profession. The central question the inquiry was required to address was this: how had someone like Cousins been able to join the police service and remain in his position for years without the warning signs being identified? Despite earlier concerns that had surfaced separately and were never properly examined or followed up. Significantly, following his main conviction, Cousins was also prosecuted for a number of offenses involving public exposure that had occurred before the events involving Sarah. These allegations revealed a longer pattern of concerning behavior that may have been prevented if internal oversight systems had operated more effectively, and if the earlier reports had been treated seriously rather than dismissed as isolated and insignificant incidents. The case also sparked a nationwide debate about public trust in the police, particularly about how women should respond when approached by an officer and asked to stop on a quiet street at night. A number of new recommendations concerning the verification of police identity, along with changes to procedures governing solo patrols, were introduced following the case. However, many campaigners argued that these changes had come too slowly and still did not go far enough. During the seizure and examination of Cousins' electronic devices, investigators uncovered a detail that delivered another shock to police forces across the United Kingdom. On his phone, they found an online group chat involving several former colleagues, where racist and misogynistic messages had been openly exchanged for months before the crime took place. No one in the group appeared to object to the messages or speak out to stop them. The United Kingdom's independent police conduct watchdog immediately launched a separate investigation, entirely independent of the main criminal case. The findings showed that 5 serving police officers from different forces across the country, along with 1 former employee, had been involved in sharing the offensive material during the period before Sarah became a victim. 3 of those involved were later formally charged with criminal offenses relating to the sending of grossly offensive messages through a public communications network. Their trial was conducted entirely separately from the main case. Yet it further deepened public concern about the internal culture present within parts of the Metropolitan Police at a time when public trust was needed more than ever. This development, combined with earlier findings concerning warning signs that had been missed, forced police leaders to acknowledge that the problem was not limited to one individual. Instead, it exposed systemic weaknesses within organizational culture, issues that many victims and families affected by violent crime had warned about for years but had never seen taken seriously, until Sarah's tragedy forced the entire country to confront the reality. Many years have passed since that fateful night, but for Sarah's family, time seems to have done little to soften the pain. They continue to live, continue to work, and continue to smile during holidays and family celebrations, but there is a space that nothing can ever fill. An empty chair remains at every family meal. A phone call that will never again be made on a weekend evening. A familiar laugh that now exists only in memory. Sarah was once an ordinary woman living an ordinary life, with ordinary dreams much like those of countless other young people, a job she loved, friends she cherished, and simple weekend evenings spent with the people closest to her. She was not a public figure. She did not seek attention. She never knew that her name would one day be spoken in millions of conversations around the world. Yet, as painful as her death was, it became an unintended wake-up call for millions of women everywhere about the quiet fear they carry whenever they walk alone after dark. A fear that had rarely been openly spoken about before. This case is not simply the story of one isolated crime. It exposed a difficult truth. Sometimes, the greatest danger does not come from strangers hiding in the darkness, but from the very people entrusted with protecting us people. Society has taught us to trust without question. Trust, once given, will always carry some degree of risk. But that does not mean we should stop trusting one another. It means we need systems of oversight that are strong and transparent enough to ensure that such trust is never betrayed again. No moral lesson could ever be profound enough to justify what Sarah's family has endured. No policy reform could bring her back. No sentence, no matter how severe, could truly restore what was taken. But if anything remains after everything that happened, perhaps it is this reminder. Justice, even when it arrives late, even when it can never be enough, is still worth pursuing to the very end, because it is the only thing we can do for those who are no longer here. Before this story comes to a close, there is one question that perhaps each of us should ask ourselves. If, one night, the person standing in front of you carried a badge and promised to protect you, but was in fact the real danger, would you be alert enough to recognize it? And more importantly, has our society truly done enough to ensure that stories like Sarah's are never repeated? Or are we still waiting for another tragedy before asking that question once again? Perhaps the answer is still being written, because every time we choose to speak out, every time we refuse to look away from warning signs, we contribute one small part to that answer for Sarah and for everyone who comes after her.